back here on the Newsfeed PM. Thanks for staying on. Rwandan government has condemned the US sanctions on James Kabarebe, its Minister of State for Regional Integration, over his alleged involvement in supporting the M23 rebels in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. The US Treasury Department imposed financial sanctions accusing Kabarebe, or a former army chief, of playing a key role in Rwanda's backing of the rebels. For some analysis, joined now by international relations expert Brooks Spector. Brooks, good to have you, and thank you very much for your time. Rwanda says that these sanctions are baseless and really unjustified, saying sanctions would not end the war in the DRC. Do they have a point there?
Well, I mean, it depends on how. Let's put it this way. Sanctions are a tool, and they are used to implement a particular policy, and sanctions can be applied against a country as a whole or against institutions within a country, or in some cases, in the example you're noting, against an individual. And they can involve prohibiting that person, for example, from entering the United States, or a company from having business with the U.S. or making use of American businesses, or in the case of serious sanctions against an entire country, that becomes a much wider, more all-embracing, more all-encompassing version of things. I think you'll note that the sanctions that were extended to the individual in question in Rwanda do not, to the best of my knowledge, include sanctions against the entirety of the Rwandan government, let alone the whole country.
Yeah. But are they an indication possibly of things to come? Is America saying, look, we are hearing there are some, as they put it, terrible things happening, or human rights violations that are happening, and this is a first strike of possible more sanctions to come?
Well, I mean, sanctions are, there's a ladder, let's put it that way, to give it a sort of a visual metaphor. I mean, you step first on the bottom rung, and then as things progress badly, perhaps you step up and apply more pressure, or you step up another couple of notches to apply yet more pressure. And sometimes they work, and sometimes they don't have the effect that you hope for. It all depends a great deal on whether the individual, the business, the institution, the country is prepared to move regardless of the sanctions, or whether they hurt so much that the policy in fact changes. I mean, think back to the era of the old regime in this country, and sanctions gradually ratcheted upward, most especially in the 1986 Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act, which for the United States, which set a whole series of much stronger sanctions, as opposed to some very small, relatively piecemeal actions prior to that. You go further back in history, the relatively weak sanctions against Italy in the 1930s, when it invaded Abyssinia, now Ethiopia, they did not have much effect, obviously. They were considered too weak, too many alternative ways, too many loopholes, too many trapdoors to go through, and the net effect was the Italians were not deterred. Move forward to our present circumstances, and sanctions that are being imposed against Russia in various ways. There is an argument to be made that the sanctions that are already in place against Russia as a country, its financial institutions, and various individuals are having sufficient effect that a case could be made, and I'm not saying it's true, but a case could be made that this is one of the reasons why Vladimir Putin seems to be more willing to have discussions on ending the war in Ukraine, primarily because the financial sanctions, most especially, are beginning to bite and make it difficult in Russia. Inflation is up, investment is down. There's $500 billion worth of Russian assets held abroad that are now in escrow, and some of that money is being used as pledge to gain funding for the European support of Ukraine. So I mean, it's not like there's one thing called sanctions. There is a multiplicity of ideas and techniques and tools, some of which work well and some of which sound good and don't work so well.
This particular round of sanctions targeting individuals and entities, while Rwanda is maintaining that, look, our only objective is to secure our borders and ending what it describes as armed ethnic extremism in the Great Lakes region. Could it be that Rwanda as a country could be correct in what they're saying they are trying to do, but it is now individuals who are benefiting from this particular conflict?
Well, I'm sure that individuals do benefit from the conflict, and I'm sure that some companies within Rwanda or beyond benefit from it. Just by the same token, the inhabitants of the eastern Congo in the provinces that are affected by the violence, the M23 and its presumed support from the Rwanda government or military, they're not benefiting at all. And my understanding of this is that the sanctions that are being imposed are to deter or at least tone down or ratchet back some of those efforts of support. I don't think any sanctions regimen is going to deter M23 as a rebel group for a very simple reason. It's not a government, and it's not individuals who appear to be amenable to international pressure in that way.
International pressure being mounted, according to Rwanda, is undermining Africa-led mediation efforts, saying instead that those are the ones that should be supported. Do you see this as meddling by international players in the affairs of the African continent?
Well, I mean, there are obviously two ways to look at it. One is an effort to secure the lives and security of the people who are being grievously affected by the fighting. There are any number of peacemaking, peacekeeping operations that have been made on the continent over the years. And the argument sometimes is made, in spite of the criticism of foreign involvement, when foreign countries do not get involved, then there is the criticism that people aren't doing enough, and people aren't doing enough to affect change or to lead toward an end of the fighting and lead toward peacemaking. Cast your attention slightly further to the north of Rwanda and think about the fighting in Sudan, which by some estimates is the single worst humanitarian disaster on the planet right now. And I'm quoting the International Rescue Committee. That's not my judgment. Now, how would one go about imposing sanctions in what amounts to a kind of all-encompassing civil war that is now spreading its effects over all the neighboring countries of Sudan? The number of people who are affected is terrible. What they're being affected by is worse. And as of yet, at least, I don't see that kind of push by the African Union, let alone individual African nations, to enact sanctions against the two warring parties within Sudan. So I go back to my original point, which is that sanctions are not a thing. They're a whole toolkit of things, some of which work better than others, but the proof of it usually is in their use, rather than simply saying sanctions should be applied.
Now, of course, we are hearing, for example, even in the Russia-Ukraine narrative, now almost this narrative that says, well, this war is really only going to be ended by both parties sitting around the table and having a conversation more than giving more arms and fueling more war. And it's a call that Rwanda is saying that the international community, instead of sanctions, should actually be encouraging that, particularly between Rwanda and the DRC, to say, let's sit around the table and sort this out in a peaceful manner.
Well, I mean, obviously, a conversation and a negotiation is clearly better for the society than the continuing of warfare and the desperate efforts, or increasingly desperate efforts, to impose sanctions of one type or another against an invading party. But if you go back to the issue of the moment in Ukraine, the sanctions against Russia, against the country, against the financial system, against institutions and some individuals may or may not be something of an encouragement to drive the Russians into an understanding that a negotiation may be now more useful than an invasion. Again, it's very hard to separate the effect of a sanctions regimen and compare it to, say, insisting on negotiations. All these things are possible and all these things are useful, and probably some mix of all of them is necessary.
Brooks, I appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on. International relations expert there, Brooks Spector. Some analysis, the latest round of sanctions meted out against individuals and entities, particularly in Rwanda, that America believes are linked to the M23 rebels. Right. When we continue next, what's making news here on the Newsfeed PM? Stay with us.